Central LA come to be so black? And hadn't black citizens of LA rioted before for similar reasons? Before settlers arrived in California in the 16th century, there were over 300,000 indigenous people in at least 70 different ethnic groups. Keep in mind that during the history we're about to get into, in the background, these indigenous people were impacted by contact with new diseases and systemically enslaved and killed in genocide between 1846 and 1873. The town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels of the River Porciúncula, was founded in 1781. The settlers were mostly mixed race, African and Spanish, as detailed by Paul Robinson in Race, Space, and the Evolution of Black LA, an essay in the amazing book Black Los Angeles, American Dreams and Racial Realities. These settlers came from a region in Mexico under Spanish rule with a large population of Africans and mixed race people who were major labor and defense sources. By 1800, the growing coastal pueblo was a major piece of the Spanish Empire and the largest in Alta California by 1807. During the War of Mexican Independence, most California citizens desired to break away from Spain, who limited business affairs and inhibited growth by not allowing trade with foreign merchants. In 1822, Alta California was absorbed by the newly independent Mexico, and there would be two Afro-Mexican governors, including Pío Pico, the final governor of the short-lived state from 1845 to 1846. Of course, Pico would get his own boulevard. English-speaking black people, including adventurers like James Beckworth, began arriving in the early 1800s. They would be ranchers and cowboys, and the beginning of the California Gold Rush in 1848 brought over 300,000 people, including approximately 4,000 black wealth seekers, to the state over the next 7 years. By 1850, when California entered the Union, there were 3,530 people in the city of Los Angeles, according to the census, and 15 were black, mostly hailing from Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, and New York. While California was supposedly a free state, in 1852, California passed its own fugitive slave law, permitting enslavers to hunt down their former property. 73 more black people arrived or were born in the following decade, including Robert Curry Owens, whose grandmother was the once enslaved nurse Biddy Mason, one of the first black American women to own land in LA. She had come to the state as a slave and had won her freedom in court with the help of Rob Owens and his family. When free, not only did she make money, but she was generous with it too. She had properties along Spring Street and helped sponsor the city's first black church, the first African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles. Robert inherited her estate and his father's estate and his name, making him the richest black man in Los Angeles at the end of the 19th century. One of those properties was this commercial building, which Biddy had purchased in 1866 for $250 on the outskirts of Los Angeles. By 1907, it was near the city center, boasting employment resources, a music store, a doctor's office, and jewelry store. The census records of the 1870s and 1880s revealed to Robinson during his research that there were no black enclaves in the city during those times, and that families were spread out as the city industrialized. Most black men worked as barbers, and many black women worked in housekeeping. Some were making headway in other fields, like John J Neimore, who founded the Eagle newspaper in 1879. The arrival of trains meant a middle class filled with porters, most of them light-skinned or designated as mulatto. By 1900, there were 1,817 to 2,131 black people in Los Angeles. According to the California African American Museum, fewer than 30% of LA's 532 black heads of household owned property in the form of either farms or homes, while over 70% were renters. 10 years later, 9,424 black people lived in Los Angeles, and 36% of those early inhabitants were homeowners, thanks to the cheap housing erected in the 1880s. When John Neimore died in 1912, his wife Charlotta Bass took over and redubbed the paper the California Eagle. Under her leadership, it was the largest black paper in California, sending out 60,000 prints a day. It was instrumental to helping black transplants during the Great Migration get acclimated to Los Angeles and other regions in California. So by the 1910s, most black people in LA lived along South Central, where black businesses, churches, and organizations were also growing and developing at the same time that Charlotta Bass got used to running the paper. paper. A visiting W.E.B. DuBois was impressed with the black professional community in 1913. He wrote, "Nowhere in the United States is the Negro so well and beautifully housed, nor the average efficiency and intelligence in the colored population so high. Here is an aggressive, hopeful group with some wealth, large industrial opportunity, and a buoyant spirit." The blossoming trades, mostly contained to Central Avenue, were a solidified business district by 1916. The same year, there were 17 black churches along Central. And black-owned insurance companies, particularly the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance, anchored the black economy. The professionals who own these essential services, like insurance companies, funeral parlors, and medical practices, became pillars of the community. Like John and Vada Sommerville, a pair of black dentists who graduated from University of Southern California. They created the Hotel Sommerville in 1928. And back in 1914, they hosted the first meeting of the LA chapter of the NAACP in their home, and they owned properties that rented to black people, so the hotel was a natural progression for them. The Hotel Sommerville was the only hotel that black visitors to the city could count on, complete with beauty and barbershops, a haberdashery, tailor shop, doctor's office, and drugstore leased to black people. It became a hub of political and cultural activity and was built so far south along Central at 42nd Street that it pulled other black businesses and residences along with it, creating a new nucleus of the black community. The hotel fell on hard times in 1929 due to the Great Depression and was sold to white investors. It went back to black ownership in 1930 and was rechristened the Dunbar after black poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. In the following decades, the property added a nightclub, hosted concerts and salons, and served up reportedly amazing Southern food. In the 30s, wealthy black Americans moved to the West Side, or West Adams, away from poor black people in Watts and South Central. A fancy neighborhood in this section was Sugar Hill, made up of Victorian homes owned by whites. Rich and famous black people like Hattie McDaniels bought homes here, pushing the white families into Beverly Hills, Hollywood, and new West Side cities closer to the ocean. Documented Reginald Chapel and from Central Avenue to Liemert Park. While court cases in 1945 and 1948 made it legal for California black people to live anywhere, destroying housing covenants, housing discrimination continued, and the bulk of black people lived in South Central. By the 1940s, when the city saw its biggest population increase yet, 70% of the black community lived in South Central, regulated to the areas of high mortgage risk in red on this map. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, which issued loans with low down payments to the white type of American, analyzed and appraised 239 cities nationwide, including LA, to rate neighborhoods' mortgage risk on a scale of A to D. Wrote Ryan Reft for PBS, Watts, an ethnic and racial stew of Germans, Scots, Greeks, Italians, blacks, and Japanese, earned a low red grade due to its heterogeneity. If not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, Hollywood would be entitled to a higher grade. HOLC officials noted in justifying its D rating. Central Los Angeles dismayed appraisers due to its highly heterogeneous population and sprinkling of subversive racial elements. The latter comment a reference to its concentrations of Japanese and Negroes. Living in these areas meant you were categorically denied federal home loans. However, black people made small inroads in blockbusted neighborhoods, like in the city of Compton, growing from 5% of the population in 1940 to 40% just 20 years later. In South Central, there were tons of businesses catered specifically to black people, like the Alabama, a jazz club born in 1931, right next to the Hotel Dunbar. It was for those with money, and guests included everyone from Ethel Waters to Duke Ellington. Wrote Hadley Mears, besides nightly floor shows accompanied by dinners of fried chicken, Chinese food, and wine, the Alabama hosted numerous events for black and white charities. There was also an annual drag ball every Halloween because there was a growing black queer culture in LA. Another prolific business was the Aquarian bookshop. LA's longest running black bookstore was conceived of by Alfred Ligon, who saved $100 from his paychecks as a porter to open a small shop with his sister at 812 East Jefferson in 1941. Another significant portion of black Americans in the early to mid-20th century lived in Oakwood near Venice Beach, and they worked at nearby factories in Culver City and Santa Monica. They were attracted by the jobs and were 12.6% of the population in 1950. Just 9 years earlier, Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 8802, which banned federal companies and agencies from racially discriminating. This was a huge win, and California itself was growing because all of its defense and aerospace industries. So now there were new, better paying jobs for black people. And these transplants brought their traditions with them, like Juneteenth. In 1997, a 66-year-old named Jonathan Leonard, who relocated to Los Angeles Angeles in 1948, recalled, "Come June 19th of 1949, I asked, why is everybody going to work? Why are the banks open? I couldn't believe it." He began cooking out on Juneteenth and inviting others to celebrate, and the holiday spread. The arrival of so many black people terrified racists. Said LAPD Chief William H. Parker, "It is estimated that by 1970, 45% of the metropolitan area of Los Angeles will be Negro. If you want any protection for your home and family, you're going to have to get in and support a strong police department. If you don't, come 1970, God help you." This was a period of virulent racism, like anywhere else in the country. The racism was compounded by the communist Red Scare of the late 40s through 50s, especially because two of California's biggest industries were federally contracted companies and Hollywood. Black business owners were hassled, unions were discouraged, nightclubs that were rumored to be race mixing or hubs of communist activity were raided, and black intellectuals and professionals like Charlotta Bass, considered to be communists, were blacklisted. In 1947, for instance, the Occidental College canceled an appearance by Langston Hughes because he was marked red. While most LA newspapers applauded the move, the California Eagle complained about growing American fascism. Happening at the same time was violence by groups like the Spook Hunters, who attacked black people who were alone, set fires, made threats, and burned effigies, plus, like the usual KKK. Black teens organized their own gangs in response, and by the 1950s, when white people began leaving Watts and Compton, black teen gangs devolved into turf wars against each other. In the 1950s, black people were increasingly buying homes in Sugar Hill and Leimert Park. The latter was adjacent to Crenshaw and had been developed from the 1920s through 40s into a sea of Spanish colonial and minimal traditionalist homes. The billionaire Howard Hughes, whose aerospace company employed a good chunk of the population, built the Leimert Theater, the area's centerpiece, in 1932. Leimert Park international headlines when Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, was found murdered there in 1947. The same year, the 200,000 square foot open-air Crenshaw shopping plaza opened, adding prestige and mass commercialism to Baldwin Hills and Liemert Park. It came complete with a Sears and Woolworth 5 and dime. The 1.19 square mile Leimert Park was mostly white until post-racial covenant blockbusting encouraged white people into selling their homes, which would be bought at marked up rates by black people. Enter the Santa Monica Freeway, which the California Eagle described as a proposal to cut through the most prosperous, best-kept secret, and most beautiful Negro-owned property in the country, including Sugar Hill. In response, the West Adams Freeway Committee formed to fight the plans, but the highway was built anyways in 1957, ripping through Sugar Hill. Such housing displacement happened to black communities in Maryland, Louisiana, Texas, New York, and Massachusetts. And in the case of Sugar Hill, the displacement shifted even more black people into Leimert Park, and if their pockets were deep enough, Baldwin Hills. In the 1920s, the empty hills of the area had looked like good land to developers, and they erected Spanish and English-style homes with 9 to 11 rooms apiece. It was a white neighborhood, but a 1963 dam burst destroyed 64 homes and killed 5 people.
A triangle-shaped wedge tears out of the asphalt and concrete-lined wall of the earth-filled dam of the Baldwin Hills Reservoir. The water fills the 50-foot deep catch basin below the lip of the dam, and millions of gallons of water race down the canyon toward the homes below, in the community between downtown Los Angeles and International Airport.
The neighborhood's proximity to Watts in 1965 accelerated white flight, and the neighborhood was mostly black ever since, with the Baldwin Hill estate specifically known as the Black Beverly Hills. The primary concern of black Los Angeles activists in the 1960s was police brutality under the aforementioned William H. Parker. Parker helped promote and develop the prototypes of copaganda, cops as the thin blue line between polite white society and dangerous criminals and chaos. He was also an influential consultant on the radio and TV show Dragnet. Racist cops weren't punished under Parker, and he had refused to hire black people until 1962. While Los Angeles had its largest black population so far at this time, there weren't enough laws in place to allow them to move around freely. Prop 14 in 1964 allowed property owners to refuse to sell or rent to anyone, the same year that black people voted in a poll ranking the city the most desirable place to live. Prop 14, which was later ruled unconstitutional, partly inspired the riots in the predominantly black neighborhood of Watts, which was overcrowded and overpoliced. On August 11, 1965, a misunderstanding by a crowd of onlookers during a drunk driving traffic stop incited police brutality, sparking crowds to attack random whites in Watts. The next day, black leaders tried to calm the community down, and a black teen announced announced riots would spread into white LA, leading to Chief Parker, who refused to send black police, to announce he would mobilize the National Guard. He also called rioters monkeys in a zoo. This exacerbated the crisis, and the riot bloomed into looting, arson, sniper shots, and violence that didn't end until August 16th. 34 people were dead at the end of it, and most of them black. 26 were ruled justifiable homicides. 1,032 people were injured, and 4,000 more were arrested. Plus, there was $40 million in property damage. The McCone Commission, authorized by Governor Pat Brown, found that high unemployment and poor schooling and living conditions were the problem. It suggested an implementation of emergency literary and preschool programs, improved police community ties, increased low-income housing, more job training projects, upgraded healthcare services, more efficient public transportation, and many more. Of course, most of this was ignored, save for small concessions like 1968's Federal Housing Act. And when Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California in 1965, he blamed Pat Brown directly for the riots and said it was because he was soft on crime. Never mind all the rest of that shit that was mentioned, it's just because it was all about law and order. Chief Parker's profile raised after the riots, and he said communists had infiltrated the black community, and he died in 1966. Meanwhile, Reagan passed 20 laws by 1969 that expanded the power of police, prompting once warring teen gangs to turn to the Black Power movement and community watch groups like Community Alert Patrol, or CAP. Explained leader Ron Wilkins, wherever police were seen interacting with our people, we emerged from our vehicles with camera in hand to prevent foul play. By this time, the Aquarian bookstore was booming, but building a black stock of fiction and nonfiction wasn't enough. Aquarian organized classes, productions, and guest lectures. There was a spiritual center for those interested in metaphysics and a small archive of documents from black leaders. Ligon married one of his employees, Bernice, and their bookstore was a lifeline during the radicalism of the 1960s. Black bookstores across the country were nurturing the black literary tradition by carrying the works of writers from Langston Hughes to James Baldwin to Zora Neale Hurston to Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice to the autobiography of Malcolm X. There was a wealth of black nationalist materials, post-colonial histories, and communist manifestos, things that would get certain buyers placed on Cointelpro watch lists. In fact, black bookstores were surveilled in the 1960s through 1975. J. Edgar Hoover complained in a 1968 memo, "The increase in the establishment of black extremist bookstores represents propaganda outlets for revolutionary and hate publications and culture centers for extremism." As detailed by Joshua Clark Davis, Alfred and Bernice were one of many booksellers investigated by the FBI. All the way in Oakland and San Francisco Bay, black people arrived in significant numbers beginning in 1940. There, the Black Panther Party formed in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, advocating for self-defense against the police and implementing community programs. Like the other chapters, the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panthers would be targeted and dismantled by Cointelpro. Restless youth with few opportunities would turn to the Crips, Pyrus, and Bloods as guns and drugs mysteriously flooded the streets in the decades to come. Also in the 1960s, black people began to spill into the mostly Japanese American Crenshaw neighborhood. Japanese Americans had been living there before and after World War II, many of them once held in internment camps thanks to another one of FDR's executive orders. Recalled a Buddhist reverend to the Los Angeles Times, when the city's Japanese Americans were about to be interred, one of the few organizations that offered help was a Black Baptist church. Similarly, after the war, when most shopkeepers refused to sell goods to Japanese Americans, the only market that would sell food to the Buddhist church was a black-owned grocery. Fast forward to the 1970s, when there were over 763,000 black people in the city of LA, black people were now the majority of Crenshaw. They and the Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans, lived side by side. During this decade, when the first black mayor of LA, Tom Bradley, was elected, Crenshaw was the center of black LA neighborhoods. People thought Bradley would oversee police reform, but his centralized police force still predominantly went after black and Latino youth. Between 1972 and 1990, LA citizens filed over 15,000 complaints and over 5,000 lawsuits against police that cost the city $43 million in damages. Police Chief Daryl Gates, an acolyte of then-dead Chief Parker, began his term in 1978, and he was openly racist as chief. In 1982, he said, "Blacks might be more likely to die from chokeholds because their arteries do not open as fast as they do in normal people." And it's rumored that during this time, common cop slang for referring to black and white cars was calling them black and normals. During this period, there was a rise in crime, drugs, and class differences that would only be exacerbated by the late deindustrialization of the 70s and 80s, affecting a disproportionate amount of black workers, plus the war on drugs. Like most black bookstores, the Aquarian was barely profitable by the 80s, when many black bookstores were losing ground to mainstream chains and the popularity of TV and movies. Ligon told the LA Times in 1982, "We're a starvation business, but we're an institution. Even just a trickle of people who want these books justifies our existence." As publishers began to see the value of black authors like Terry McMillan in the 90s, adding black editors to their rosters, so did bookstores, who added urban sections and shelves. Consider that in 1992, the vice president at Walden Books said the 1,150 store chain now has 300 stores with African American sections, and it's adding more. I'm struggling to imagine bookstores without black authors, but they existed. After Aquarian was burnt down during the 1992 riots, $70,000 was raised by bookstores and authors like Maya Angelou, but the shop closed permanently by 1994. Bernice and Alfred both died in 2000 and 2002, respectively. Also in the 80s, the Crenshaw neighborhood grew even blacker when the children of the Japanese Americans, the sensei, left for college. Few came back, in part because anti-Asian sentiment grew, but also because the sensei made bigger financial gains than their parents and moved to more expensive enclaves. So by 1990, only 2,500 Japanese Americans remained in Crenshaw. Another black neighborhood to highlight is Ladera Heights. Filled with custom homes from the 1960s, black hotshots like baseball player Frank Robinson entered the neighborhood in the 1970s. Fast forward to the modern day, and Ladera Heights has 6,500 people. 70% of them black, and it's now known as the Black Beverly Hills. In 1990, middle-class black Americans were fleeing South Central's poverty, a 40% unemployment rate, drugs, and gangs to suburbs like Riverside. In Oakwood, which had become 45% black in the 70s, homeowners sold their property, shrinking the black population there to 22%. And after the 1992 LA riots, Leimert Park Village emerged as an important center for lower to middle-class black LA, and the perfect setting of Moesha. Described Jonathan Gold in a feature on Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg for Rolling Stone in 1993, Leimert Park is the intellectual center of African American life in Los Angeles. Jazz clubs, coffee houses, bookstores, art galleries, a theater and a fine old movie palace, the restaurants that draw people from all over town. Neatly suited Muslims stand on the street corners offering newsletters and bean pies for sale. Reggae blasts from the record shops. Marla Gibbs from 227, by the way, bought the Leimert Theater and renamed it the Vision Theater before losing ownership by the end of the decade. The vibrancy and fun of Leimert Park was starkly different from what people thought of when they envisioned the gritty South Central LA depicted in gangster rap. To be fair, over 45 black gangs had emerged in 1978, and there were approximately 409 with 57,000 members of all colors by 1992.